Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Carol Weissert. I'm a professor of political science here at FSU, and I'm also the director of the Leroy Collins Institute at FSU. This event tonight is being sponsored by the Leroy Collins Institute and the FSU Institute of Politics. I want to welcome you to this session that we may be calling the final sprint to the 2021 legislative session. We're not doing the ordinary thing of waiting till the end of the session and saying, oh, what passed? We're letting you get a little bird's eye view here from a couple of terrific experts about what's going to be happening in the legislature over the next 10 days when they are slated to go home. So we'll talk tonight about what's happened. We're going to talk about what may happen and what to watch for over the next 10 days. I think there may still be some people, I hope not, but in Tallahassee or elsewhere who still think that all the actions in Washington, but I think you'll be convinced after our discussion today that that's not true. State legislatures all over the country and certainly in Florida are taking on the big issues and issues that really matter to us as citizens, from insurance to climate change, from data privacy to anti-riot laws, from potency of medical marijuana to how our elections are conducted, and many, many more. So tonight we have two experts on Florida politics and especially the Florida legislature. We're going to talk generally. I'm going to ask them a few questions. They're going to respond. We're going to get things started, but we also want to welcome your questions as well. So my request is that you put in your questions in the Q&A, and then I'll be able to see them, and we'll be able to get these experts to deal with your questions as well. The first person I want to introduce is Carlecia Collins. She's a government consultant with Gray Robinson. She has extensive legislative experience working for the Florida Speaker, for the Senate President, and other leadership roles in the Florida Senate. She is an FSU undergrad, and she is a graduate of the FSU Masters in Applied Politics program, otherwise known as MAAPP, which is our terrific program that we have to put people out, really inform people into the political arena. Our second speaker, or our second person on the panel, is Slater Bayliss. He is a co-founding member of the Advocacy Group of Cardenas Partners. He has extensive experience at the state, national, and local level, including in Jeb Bush's administration, and he's worked in national campaigns and organizations, but he's also extremely active in a number of state and local boards and commissions. He must spend all of his time in meetings at night and in day. Both of them are in fact lobbyists, and they're going to be talking to you from their very, very well-informed position in watching the legislature more closely than anybody else. Slater has a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Iowa, and also is a MAAPP graduate. We're going to turn to the issues, but first I'd like to ask Slater to set the stage a bit. Slater, can you talk briefly about the governor's role, the legislature's responsibilities and limitations, and the importance of legislative leadership in producing the policy that we're talking about tonight?
Yeah, Carol, I'd be happy to, and it's a pleasure to be with you. I am a huge fan of all of the exciting work that's happening at IOP, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say how grateful I was to get to hang out with you, but also with my good buddy Carlecia Collins, who's been a dear friend over the years. And I think the Florida political process is better because Carlecia's in it, and I mean that sincerely. One thing you did say that really struck a chord with me, and I think should reflect on, is this idea that people think all the actions in Washington D.C., but in reality, states are they were designed to be the laboratories of democracy, and the issues that we get to deal with at the state level affect everyday people, everyday's life, and I think that's really, really neat. To your question, I think the really important thing I think you have a very well-informed audience, but obviously elections have consequences, and in Florida, we in our last presidential election, 14 million people voted, or 14 million voters, 11 million, give or take, voted, and although the country went for President Obama, the state went for Donald Trump, and it had huge down ballot effects. So we've got massive Republican majorities in the Senate. We've got a 24-16 majority. And in the House, we've got a 78-42 Republican majority. And so along with Governor DeSantis, that sets up a process of a legislature that in both chambers is Republican and a governor who's Republican. So you're going to hear a lot about policies that are Republican driven tonight. And I think it's important to talk about, to your point, how the process works, because the one thing I think, as many of you know, that the Florida Legislature must do is to pass a budget before June 30th. Every other bill they talk about and they debate and they pass is a bonus, but that they have to pass a budget. And unlike the federal government, it has to be balanced. And that creates a lot of opportunity for deals to be made and policies to be traded for budgetary priorities, et cetera. And to me, that's really the art of the process. But I think it's important to recognize that the Florida Legislature is term limited, and therefore you've got these classes of legislators, seniors, juniors, sophomores, and freshmen. And in both chambers, they each essentially elect a class president to be their leader, or their Senate president, or their speaker. And those people, I think you see them come out with priorities, much like the governor comes out with priorities. But with Senator Simpson and Speaker Sprowls, their priorities are really the priorities of others in many cases. They're the representatives or the leaders of their chambers. But what they really have in the legislature, and Carlecia will want to talk about this later, but is the power of the purse. The legislature makes the budget. And while the governor kicks off the legislative session with his State of the State speech, where he outlines his priorities, until they're done 60 days later, when he can subtract things but not add things to the budget, his role is consultative in nature. He doesn't have a vote. And so that sets up, I think, a really neat dynamic between the way that the sausage gets made, so to speak.
But the governor was pretty successful, I think, in this legislature, if he doesn't have a role, guys, you're right, because I think when his State of the State address, he talked about an anti-riot bill, let's call it HB1. He talked about election reform. He talked about going after big tech in some way, limiting big tech. What's going on with those? Are those bills, those things going to get through?
Well, I think those are all the bills that Carlecia's lobbying, so those are absolutely going to pass.
Thank you for thinking like that.
So he must have some power in the legislature, right, Carlecia? Because those are bills that the legislature is taking up and sort of following his lead, right?
They are taking up those bills. Some have passed. One was signed yesterday, so we'll talk about that later. So it's been interesting to watch it from this perspective. As we talked about earlier, I was in the legislature for many, many years. And so being on this side of it and seeing how the sausage is made on this side of it has been quite interesting as a lobbyist now. Having to request appointments versus being asked for appointments is quite the interesting opposite situation. So it's been fun getting to learn how bills are made, how laws are made, and how bills are even formed from this perspective. It has been something I would never thought I would do in life, but it's been quite rewarding so far. Yeah.
So one of those bills was signed yesterday by the governor was HB1, which is 61 pages or something like that, sometimes called the anti-riot bill. So that's signed by the governor. That is in place. What can you guys tell our audience about HB1?
Yeah, so I'll see if I can take that one. House Bill 1 was something the governor outlined, as you mentioned, Professor, in his State of the State speech. It was also something that our speaker, who comes from a criminal justice background where he was a gang prosecutor, I think had some pretty strong law and order thoughts. And it was something that was at times got very partisan. I think that the dialogue really was fascinating on both sides of the conversation, and ultimately it passed both chambers and headed to the governor, who I think just day before yesterday signed it down in Pasco County. So that's, to your point, notch one up for the governor and the speaker there in terms of priorities.
But the one I think you signed last night, there wasn't as much of a hoopla about it because it's going to make a lot of difference to our viewers because we're going to be paying sales taxes on internet sales now. Florida was one of only 2 states that had not passed this, but we don't want to call it a tax increase, right? It is what is it?
Yeah. Well, Carlecia, I'll frame it up and Carlecia can take it from there. So truth be told, the taxes have been due on internet purchases for forever. I know certainly Professor, along with Carlecia and I, you've been self-reporting those taxes to the Department of Revenue as we've been required under Florida law for the last decade. But the enforcement mechanism now to collect those taxes is in place, and it really was one of the most artful things I think that I've seen in legislative gymnastics from a messaging perspective, in that they reduced business rent tax or business property tax payments commensurate with the new revenue that they'll raise from this from the collection of the tax that's been on the books for years.
Just making like it just leaves an even playing field for brick and mortar and online stores. So it just makes it all fair.
Yeah, tax neutral. That's what it's called. So they didn't have to go through a lot. So those 2 things are kind of in the hopper. They're done deals. So what's still in play? I think Slater, you said at one time that there's very little that's off the table. So what's in play that we need to know about?
Yeah, we're in the let's make a deal phase of the Florida Legislature with 9 days left. As we like to think of it, there's a former Senate President, Don Gates, once said, everything's connected to everything. And he was very right. The leverage of how you get these deals done largely exists within the state budget, where every member has something that they'd like to bring home to their constituents. And until that budget is final, members tend to stick with the game plan to get the bills that have been agreed on over the finish line. So we're in our final throes of budget conferencing. We've got the data privacy legislation you referred to. The deplatforming legislation is still out there. Both property insurance reform and PIP reforms, which I think are tied together, are still out there. Gaming has been talked about a lot over the last 2 weeks. I think get the sense we're close to the state is close to a deal with the Seminole tribe, which would have a lot of downstream effects. Carlecia, what else is out there that we're missing?
I was going to say that's the talk about special session. As the gaming, that's what popped up with that conversation is always special session.
But wait a minute, why would we need a special session? We're still in this one.
Oh, you can't. You got to always think ahead, right?
Yeah. Well, Professor, you got to first have a session. Then you have a special session, and then if you don't get it right, you have a very special session.
A, B, and C. Maybe D.
They just don't have time to do it, and now is that why they're talking about a special session?
Look, sorry, Carlecia, go ahead.
I was going to say with the federal money that came in, it always adds more questions than answers, and we have to figure out what to do with those dollars. As Slater said on a call we had earlier, DeSantis has embraced the money where past governors said no federal dollars, but DeSantis wanted to keep those dollars because if we don't take them, they go to other states. So we have to figure out what to do with those dollars, and that's going to be important for our state.
Okay, very good. So what about gaming? I think a lot of people probably thought we already had a Seminole compact. So why do we need a gaming and what's going on?
Yeah, so the Seminole Compact that Governor Chris signed had 2 components to it, as I recall it. One dealt with slot machines, and that was a 20-year compact piece of the contract, so to speak. And one dealt with banked card games, and that was a 5-year piece that has expired. And so, and it expired 3, 4, 5 years ago. And it's been an ongoing negotiation between Governor Scott and the tribes, and now Governor DeSantis and the tribes to get certainty in that contract, which ironically, back to your budget question, creates the most important kind of state revenue, which is recurring revenue. So money that can be spent on projects for the next 20 years. Whereas what we have a lot of right now, as Carlecia mentioned, is federal funds coming down that are one-time funds. And so a deal with the Seminole tribe kind of helps all of these other needs that we have as a state work out.
What about other kinds of betting? Sports betting? That's a lot of states are looking at sports betting, another way to sort of get state revenues. Is that an issue in Florida?
Yeah, I would assume, yes, absolutely. Dealt with it in the past, and it's still something we'll deal with in the future.
Yeah, I'd take the over on that for sure.
Ah, you take the over. Okay, well, that would also bring in money for the state.
Yes, sports betting's a really big deal. On the one hand, you've got DraftKings and FanDuel, who are kind of the national platforms. The professional sports, the Major League Baseball, the NFL, the NBA, the PGA of America, all have a stake in making sure that there's a product that wouldn't impede the integrity of their game. And then, you know, you've also got a constitutional amendment to deal with that the voters passed that would require some creativity on behalf of the legislature to make that work in a way where it complied with that constitutional amendment. Creativity,
huh? Very good. All right, so that sounds good. But yeah, you were talking about non-recurring dollars. So I wanted to go back to this a little bit because 3 or 4 months ago, it looked like that the legislature was not going to have very much money, right, to be dealing with in this session because a lot of businesses were closed down, tourists weren't coming, our sales tax revenues are down, and all of a sudden, looks like we're in pretty good shape in terms of the budget. So what's going on in that? Some non-recurring, non-recurring dollars in there?
Take it, Slade, if you want to.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. I think the compounding effect of our tourist economy being shut down and the Medicaid rolls going up, and then also you add to that kind of the state's cost of the unemployment, our revenues were down and our expenditures were up. And so that's when you saw Governor DeSantis do something at the end of last session that I've never seen before and I admired greatly, is he vetoed $1 billion from last year's budget. And I think about half of that were priorities that he had actually recommended to the legislature. So, you know, the governor said, look, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. We have to do this for our state. And the really interesting thing is by slashing that $1 billion from last year's budget, that cash goes back into general revenue for future years. And now with as people are going back to work and the Medicaid system isn't as burdened and tourists are coming back because our state is open. We just saw, Carlecia will know this better than I will, but I think last week, the revenue estimators, the state's economists, revised up our revenues by about $2 billion, which is essentially 2% of the budget, which is that's they say there's two kinds of money in government. There's the kind that jingles and the kind that folds. When you're talking about with money with a B, that's definitely the kind that folds.
Yeah, we have to thank our governor for keeping our state open a little bit more than other states. So that'll definitely help with the non-recurring dollars.
Well, what about the federal dollars? Aren't we getting a bunch of money from the feds too? That probably will help.
$10 billion. Yeah, that'll definitely help.
And that's the non-recurring kind.
That's the non-recurring.
Yeah. 10 billion or something like that. Okay, I want to remind our audience too, I'm waiting for questions from you guys. I have a lot of questions, but I think you probably do too. So be sure and just go use the Q&A and get your questions in, and we'll go with that. Political polarization is something that we hear a lot about these days in Washington, but everything isn't so polarizing. Can you think, are there some examples in the legislature now where you actually do see some bipartisanship?
Yeah, I think, in Florida particularly, you don't really, people think, Washington, D.C. is all very, very one-sided. They don't really agree. But in Florida, we have the fortunate position that a lot of the bills that pass in legislature are all very partisan. Both sides agree on this 50-50. There's majority of them are. There's very few bills that pass in our legislature that don't have majority or both sides agreeing to them. So it's fortunate for us that our members agree on a lot of issues. That they may come about a little bit different, but they, for the most part, agree on a lot of the major issues that passed the legislature.
So what's an example, Carlecia, of something that there was a bipartisan support for?
Hey, well, there's all the sea level rise and stuff going on right now, all the dollars going towards that, and the budget issues that are going on, those kind of issues are both sides want money to go towards important things, teachers' salaries, those kind of things are going to get both sides agreeing to give money to teachers or to our elderly population. Those kind of issues will get bipartisan support for sure.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, Professor, to Carlecia's point, one of the neatest bipartisan proposals I've seen in a long time is the package that passed last week after the compromise. It preserves the affordable housing largely, but uses other pieces of the Sadowski Fund, which is the documentary stamp revenue piece, to bond out $1 billion for sea level rise and for septic to sewer conversions. Which are two things that Republicans and Democrats, I think, really agree on. We live on a peninsula. And look, I think Florida is very unique in national politics in that Republicans here largely are Theodore Roosevelt Republicans in terms of how they feel about the environment. Our Republicans here are much greener than Republicans in Pennsylvania or New York.
Well, that's because we live on such a tenuous spot, right? We have so much ocean, and with the climate change, we're the most vulnerable state.
We are indeed.
So I have a question. So this is a building up on going back to the gambling. Is the current hope to set up a new compact with the Seminole tribe that will set up a percentage of annual casino profits to continuously flow into the state budget? Is that how it works, or how does it work?
Yeah, I mean, that is certainly a big part of it, are the revenue shares that the Seminoles would continue to pay to the state of Florida, which is, depending upon, it's somewhere around $350 million a year is what it's been in the past. The other part to it, which the governor has been particularly sensitive to, is we've got somewhere around 20 parimutuel facilities throughout the state of Florida. So think, dog tracks, high life ontons, no more dog tracks, but high life ontons and different types of horse racing. And those facilities employ a lot of people. And so one of the things this governor has been very sensitive to is ensuring that those Florida businesses are preserved and deals with the tribe.
So the answer is yes. The hope is to set up a new compact that'll set up a percentage of annual casino profits plus, right? So that's one thing, but then they're also working with all these other issues as well, right?
Exactly.
Okay. And another question about something we talked about. Do you mind going into more detail about the sales tax bill? What does it entail and how will it affect me? Whoever wants to answer is fine.
I'll take a shot at it, and Carlecia can jump in here. I think, as I mentioned earlier, for the last 20 years, citizens have been required, although many did not, to report purchases online and pay your sales tax to the Department of Revenue. Obviously, it was an inconvenience. The law was not very well known. Not many people did it. But I think the interesting thing is what it does is it sets up a situation where, because of the tax offset we talked about earlier, where existing commercial businesses will no longer pay as much commercial rent. And as we know, businesses, if they pay an additional tax, they pass that on to their consumers. And so I think what we'll see is local businesses reducing costs on a lot of items because they're no longer paying that rent. And then also our local business, to Carlecia's earlier point, being able to be more competitive for Florida consumer dollars when it comes to choices on where to go shopping, because the sales tax is now going to be collected whether you walk into Walmart or you go online and buy the whatever you're buying.
Yeah, so it was a basically fairness kind of, it's revenue to the state, but also it was kind of a fairness bill so that you're all, your local, if you go to your local store, you save sales taxes. If you buy it online, you didn't. So this really evens the playing field a little bit.
That's right. And Professor, I think it's important to note that bill has been being worked on for about 5 years, ever since the Wayfarer Supreme Court decision. And so it wasn't a bill that was filed for the first time 60 days ago. It's really been something that's been worked on by a lot of tax lawyers over the years to get it right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that bill was estimated to bring about $1 billion into the GR for the state. So it's a big deal. Something that we should have been doing for a while.
Big money. That's the folding kind of money, right, Slater?
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. It helps better fund universities also.
Yes. So a university question. What about the bill that would set up surveying university faculty and students on their political beliefs?
I will be honest, I am not sure I'm familiar with that bill.
Same.
Oh, you don't know
Is
it?
it-
Oh, okay, interesting. Well,
Yeah,
we're
so just,
following it pretty closely.
and yeah, we happy to put together a memo on that. I mean, just so for situational awareness, I think something like 4,000 bills are filed. And so it's sometimes a little complicated to know what's in every one of them, but I don't, is that part of the civics education conversation?
No, it's a separate one. It's concerned. The concern is, whether students feel safe talking about political issues on campus, or whether they sort of curtail their political views because they, don't want to be ostracized or something.
Like a freedom of speech type of situation?
Pardon?
Like a freedom of speech type of situation?
Yeah. And then there's also, it involves a survey of students and faculty to see if there are any occasions when students maybe felt uncomfortable talking about issues in class. And then there's a part about students could actually video professors in the classroom. So we're following that issue probably more closely.
This is the ideological diversity bill. Is that
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it was voted on in the Senate 2 weeks ago, maybe. Yeah, sorry, unfamiliar with the bill, but
Okay.
I now I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I apologize.
Kind of still out there, huh? Okay, so there's another bill that the question is coming on is, do you believe that either the Florida retirement system reform bill and or the union weakening bills will pass this session? So the Florida retirement bill, remember, would take people out. The new hires would not be part of the FRS, but would go into their TIA or other kinds of programs. And then the union weakening bills, we probably know what those are.
The FRS bill did pass the Senate already, so.
In the House, do you know? Yeah, right. One day. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and this FRS bill is something that's been around for, again, 10 years. I think Speaker Weatherford was the first to talk about some of these reforms, and there have been bills filed over the years. But I think you see, to the earlier point, this is I believe it's a Senate President priority, and so it seems to be moving pretty well. I don't know whether ultimately it's a this year or a next year thing.
Yeah.
But typically when a presiding officer doesn't get something passed in year one, they figure out a way to get it passed in year two.
Yeah. They have a little clout there.
Yeah, and I look on the union bills. There's a few out there. Some of them deal with local government contracting. Some of them deal with union dues. I think the Florida is a right to work state, and you've got a very, very conservative legislature, as we talked about earlier, and those bills typically end up passing.
I think
votes.
Also, the one of the ones that I read about too is that it's one where you have to automatically re-up your union membership every year. In other words, you can't just say I'm a member this year and I will continue. So that's another one of the bills that that people are following, I think. Okay, here's a question. I'm sorry.
The retirement bill has no companion in the House, so it's got two committees of reference that it hasn't taken up at all. So it's one of those priorities, but it's kind of just flailing right now. But as they always say, it's not dead until it's dead. So we don't really know what's happening with that one yet either.
So maybe flailing, but not dead, huh?
Yeah.
Another,
Some of those we call zombie bills.
Yeah.
that was the retirement bill, right, Carlecia? Okay, so another question about the environmental area. This has been an area on climate change where the governor has been active in this area, and there's some legislation, I think, in the legislature. Anything that you expect anything to happen on this kind of climate change, algae blooms, sea level rise, general kind of environmental issues?
Yeah, well, look, what I'll say is, I'll disclose that I have the privilege of representing the Environmental Defense Fund. And so we work on a lot of these issues. And I mean, really, you saw the governor came out. Part of a major platform of this campaign was clean water. You talked about the algae blooms. I think there's $10 million in the budget to keep dealing with innovative technologies. As happened previously, there's the resiliency bill that kind of nips and tucks the chief resiliency officer, who's also the secretary of the Department of Economic Opportunity. And then you've got obviously the speaker and the Senate president came out with a joint op-ed right before session on sea level rise, and they've backed that up with the passing of the resiliency bill. So it's to your point earlier, Professor, we live on a peninsula that is very fragile, and I think we've got leaders who recognize those, and those are some of the great bipartisan things. I would say, and I don't want to put Carlecia on the spot, but one of the future kind of interesting policy conversations that I'd like to maybe see if we get the IOP fellows to get engaged here, because they're one of the smartest groups of people I've ever had the privilege of meeting, is there's this idea we pay a fuel tax. Every time you refuel your car, you pay a tax, and it gets sent up to Washington, D.C., and then 96% comes back to Florida, and it goes to the Department of Transportation. They use it to build roads. But now we have pretty tremendous adoption in Florida of electric vehicles, and those vehicles don't pay any gas tax. So they're using the infrastructure without paying gas tax. Having said that, all of the benefits that EVs bring to Florida are significant. And so there's kind of a future policy conversation about how we can keep building the infrastructure that we need for all of our cars, and also for hurricane evacuations. Obviously, electric cars will have trouble in hurricane evacuations if there's not enough charging capacity. But how you fund that? Do you put a new fee on electric vehicles? And the Florida Legislature typically doesn't vote yes on taxes and fees, but you need it for the infrastructure. So for me, it's one of the most interesting kind of political riddles to see how we'll figure this out going forward.
Yeah,
I see an assignment in
great
kids'
issue.
futures. I see a class assignment in your kids' futures.
I think a number of states are doing is more a mileage tax. So instead of just doing the gasoline, you figure out how many miles you drove, and then you're taxed on that. So that's kind of another area. I told you we had a great audience, an informed audience. So this is an informed audience question. Can you explain Senate Bill 48 on charter schools? With all of the money going to Step Up for Students, what is the effect on traditional public education?
Senate Bill 48.
Yeah, it's on charter schools.
Yeah, is that the Representative Fine bill, Carlecia? Do you know?
That's the Brandis and Garcia Baxley bill. It's the Educational Scholarship Program 48.
Yeah, it talks about with all this money going to Step Up for Students, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, this bill, and Carlecia will be much better informed than I will be on it. Obviously, school choice is something that there's been a tremendous investment in by the state of Florida in terms of, help allowing parents, whether they're wealthy or not, to have a choice of schools for their kids, and for kids not to be trapped in underperforming schools. And so this is a continued theme that I think you see in the legislature, is how you nip and you tuck and you help have opportunity to access for education. Now, I know obviously the other side of that is that people feel like some of these schools are destined for failure because the funds are being diverted to charter schools. But the Senate Bill 48, I think, has has a huge component with the Gardner scholarships. All of that language is in there, isn't it, Carlecia?
Yeah, I believe that does touch on that as well. There's a few bills of that, and it's going well in the Senate. That's where it's located right now. So it's definitely moving in both chambers, well, in the Senate bill, and it has a House component that's moving as well.
Yeah, and I think the spirit of the question was, is it diverting resources
Right.
that would otherwise go to public schools? Do I understand that right?
Yes, that's how I read it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was quick. So another issue many of our audience might be in following relates to the initiative process. Last November, the voters turned down the opportunity to vote twice on constitutional amendments. And now the legislature's back with more restrictions. Can you talk about these? There's a limit on funding, individual funding of initiatives, and then there's one that I guess calls for not a 60% vote, but a 66 2/3% vote of the people to pass.
Yeah, well, look, very interesting that when the amendment to raise the constitutional threshold from 50 plus 1 to 60% was adopted, it was adopted with less than 60% of the voters back in, I think it was 2004. Secondly, I think to this day, I'm the only person to have run a campaign that actually repealed something from the Constitution. And so constitutional amendments are something that I think is a vital part of our democracy in Florida, the citizens' right to petition. I think the really interesting one for me, I think the threshold is what the threshold is. I mean, that's very, it seems rather political. But the interesting one for me is there's a bill that I think Senator Rodriguez with an S, Ray Rodriguez, has that would cap the contribution limit to campaign initiatives. And I think, what you saw particularly on the medical marijuana citizens initiative is one or two big funders funded those, and they're very expensive campaigns because of the way the system is set up to collect the signatures and in certain congressional districts. And so it gets ridiculously expensive just to qualify for the ballot. So that would, that bill would clearly have a huge impact on citizens initiatives going forward, which I think was part of where we reviewed the Constitution in 1965 and kind of gave citizens a new avenue to petition their government.
Oh, the John Morgan bill, right?
Anti-John Morgan bill.
It's not for the people, Carlecia.
Not for the
What about, so I missed your estimate on whether you think those are going to pass or what's going to happen with those?
Professor, I feel like those bills generally take 2 years to pass. I mean, those are big bills that require a lot of debate, a lot of conversations among stakeholders. Once you do those things, it's hard to undo them. And look, that's one thing about the Florida legislative process is it is very deliberate. Very little gets done by accident. The committee process, the public vetting, they're an important part of the process. And look, that's not to say that things don't end up in amendments on the floor that no one's debated in the committee, but largely speaking, it's a very transparent process.
With this being a COVID year, like I said earlier, if it's not dead, ashes to ashes, it could rise. So while we think it might not pass just yet, it could come out of the woodwork. So we'll see.
Well, talking about deliberate, one of the things, big issues we haven't talked about is the election reform bill. I know that's undergone some changes, I guess, in the Senate. It's moving through the House, and I think a lot of the audience has probably heard a lot about this. So what's going on with election reform?
Yeah, look, I think there are elections bills every year in the legislature, particularly after presidential elections, because we learn something every year or every cycle. We learn something, and look, the interesting thing for me is I was around back in 2000 where we had a little recount, and the more I learned about the election system, the more disgusted I was in terms of the way that it worked. And so it's pretty interesting. You go 20 years forward, and in a lot of ways, Florida has an election system that's a model for the country. And I think the intention, and this was again a governor's priority, but the intention of the legislature here, and Carlecia may want to expound upon this, but is to take a program take an elections process that seems to be working, and make sure we're constantly improving upon it, because there are, as technology evolves, there's different fraud things. I think the ballot boxes were assumed to be staffed by people, but then they weren't, and then can they be moved? And you've got all these anecdotal stories you hear, and I know for some this elections bill maybe goes a little further than the ID, which is what we started with. We start talking about wet signatures and what that means, and I know people's signatures change over the years, so it's a complicated conversation for sure. But yeah, absolutely, this bill will pass.
All right, wet signatures. You have to explain what that means.
Yeah, well, it's the opposite of a dry signature.
Oh,
right.
the
So a lot of elections or election supervisors have a digital, like you would sign a credit card receipt at Target on a digital screen, and this bill would require a wet signature, which essentially is a way of saying a signature with ink or marker or something that is not digital but is wet.
It's not digital. Interesting. Well, interesting terminology. So could you talk a little bit about the process this year? Because, I know I've heard a lot of complaints from people that when they wanted to go to talk, they couldn't get in to see the legislators. They had to go, when they testified, they had to go to the Tucker Civic Center and sit 6 feet apart from each other. Can you talk about what that process was? And how did it affect your lobbying and people, really the legislators talking to real people?
Well, for me, being a new lobbyist, I don't have anything I'm used to. So I am used to being inside the Capitol and seeing lobbyists in the rotunda and having them pop in the office quickly. But this time it's all via the internet. If you're in the house, you can go see a member, but it's mask on, go up the elevator to the office, back down outside. You can't walk around at all. It's all very mechanical. And going to the Civic Center at the Senate, we love them to death, but the rules have changed a few times throughout session to make things more efficient. And before, you could come 3 hours before your meeting and hand in your card to speak or waive in opposition or for it. And then now you have to go 30 minutes for the committee meeting in the Senate and go through the gun safety, you having metal detectors, that thing, and make sure you have no weapons on you or anything like that, and then sit 6 feet apart. And it's all very mechanical now. It's hard to talk to members and get your priorities heard. Just being a person, it's really weird. Texting members instead of seeing them face to face is quite interesting for me, because normally I just pop in and say, hey, what's going on? But can't do that anymore. It's a really different process. And I'm sure Slater, being a seasoned lobbyist, definitely is feeling the pain. From
hard for you guys too, right? Because you couldn't get in to talk to the members either.
Yeah, look, I think the legislature did what they felt the right thing to do was, given that there was a pandemic. The Senate, as Carlecia said, took a little different approach than the House did. I think in a lot of ways the process has been distorted because of it. One of a lobbyist's number one job really is to be trusted. Our job is to find unintended consequences of bills and amendments, and oftentimes we do that because we work with our clients who are the ones who would have to implement these bills, and there's something that is well intended, but because a comma's in the wrong place is non-workable. And we can have 100 hallway conversations with different members and different stakeholders throughout the day at the Capitol that have been lost in the contraction of the ability for face-to-face conversations. My prediction, and look, the legislature and the staff are doing the best they can possibly do, but they're missing a huge stakeholder in terms of the experts who who understand the nuances, and I think we'll end up with a lot of glitch bills next year.
Interesting.
Would be my prediction.
Well, even for, even to the staff level, not being able to talk to these committee staff, members aside, which is super important, talking to the experts in the office, the analysts, even the assistants, it's really difficult not having those connections. If you don't know the people, you're at a disadvantage. Advantage for me is I actually know them, so I can call, thankfully. But a lot of people that don't have that advantage are struggling right now.
Yeah, and Professor, there's like this algebraic equation. You're probably much more familiar with its where it came from, its origin, than I am, but it's called the Forgotten Man. And there have been, Roosevelt used it for the New Deal. Emily Schley's, it was the title of a book she recently wrote. But I think there's a connection here, because the idea is that A observes something which seems wrong to him, from which X is suffering, right? So A then goes and talks it over with B. A and B propose to do something to fix this problem they've observed that X has, without talking to X. And then whatever law or tax they propose to fix this, they basically decide what C is going to do to fix the problem that they perceived X to have. And no one's ever, A and B haven't talked to C or X in this equation. And so you've got this interesting thing with all these variables that you're trying to solve for something without all of the stakeholders at the table. And it's an awful saying, but I think it's true in politics, whether you're in Washington, D.C. or Tallahassee, Florida, or Dunedin, Florida. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
So Slater, glitch bills. So that's something that has to be going the next year. We have to correct it, right?
Those comments.
That's right.
Yeah. So that's one of your distributing. The letter says more glitch bills because of the problems. Well, and also I think that I think for lobbyists, you're talking about the expertise, but also it's been very difficult for people, for the fishermen in Key West, right? Who want to talk about something. They have to drive up to Tallahassee and go to the Civic Center, and so I think that I've just heard a lot of dissatisfaction that this legislature is not getting this sense from the people or from the lobbyists. And glitch bills, it sounds like that's one of the things that's going to come from that for sure, I think. One other thing I wanted to ask about is local preemption. Now, when I teach state politics, I talk about, the political parties have certain preferences, and Republicans tend to like local government. They don't like central government. But it looks to me like there's a lot of stuff going on in the legislature this time, whether it's the cruise ships in Key West, or whether it's the reducing police funding, where the local governments are really getting sort of shafted this time. What's going on there?
Yeah, so I mean, from a preemption perspective, I think the premise, right, is at the federal level, it was the states, the 50, the states who created the union, and therefore you've got this whole idea of states' rights. The inverse is really true at the state level. The states created the cities and the counties. The cities and counties didn't create the states. And so I think from a Republican perspective, the premise is a little bit differently when you're talking about this notion of federalism versus home rule. And so I think you'll continually see, and I've seen it for 15 years, this idea that the legislature has every right in the world in their mind to preempt the states because they're a better setter of preempt the local governments because the state created the local governments rather than the inverse. But it's a big issue, and we do a lot of work with counties, and there's a balance that needs to be achieved there for sure.
Yeah. Anyway, I hear a lot of griping about from local government too on that. Especially like the cruise ships in Key West, where the people of Key West passed an initiative to keep the cruise ships from coming back, and the legislature saying, no, we don't want you to do that.
Yeah. Well, but Professor, that's actually an interesting anecdote in the way that the process works, because the way that bill was first filed, it would have affected every port in the entire state. And as it went through the process, it got narrowed to the problem that the bill sponsors were really trying to solve. But at one point it was a place where it was going to preempt every one of our deep water ports, and now it's gotten whittled down to it preempts one. Although it's not what I know the people in Key West would like to see, it also is indicative of how the process works well.
Good. So anything surprised you about the session?
I mean, the process, we talked about earlier, the process in itself has just been surprising for me. Being a new lobbyist, the entire thing has been surprising. Learning everything, meeting all the new clients I have, it's all very surprising. Nothing is normal. Everything is different. Literally nothing is the same as normal. So yes.
Slater?
I agree with Carlecia. As a rule, I'm never surprised with anything that happens in the Florida legislature. But I'll tell you, more than anything, I've been inspired. I mean, you've got these elected legislators who make $29,000 a year for what they thought was going to be a part-time job that's expected to be a full-time job. Tallahassee is an impossible place to fly to from anywhere but Miami. So they all drive back and forth every week, taking time away from their families and their real lives to come up here and get a Q-tip jammed up their nose before they can enter the Capitol to test negative for COVID. And then they go and they set about the job that they've been elected to do. And 9 times out of 10, these legislators are real believers. They have a duty to serve their constituents. And look, they come from all different places that are different than Tallahassee and have different constituents they serve, but there really is an earnest desire to get things right. And I think where we've come as a state and a country over the past year with this just awful pandemic and all the sacrifices that have been made, the fact that we're where we are right now with people getting to go see friends again in coffee shops, and we've had access to this incredible scientific accomplishment with the vaccines. I'm so grateful, really, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, you hear a lot of people complain, particularly outside of Tallahassee. When I go to Miami, people complain about Tallahassee, and they mean the legislature. But there's a lot to be proud of, right? That's what sort of you're saying, and they're doing the best they can. They're certainly taking on a lot of the hard issues. And they may have to come back.
Yeah, special session.
Yeah.
I think my time is almost over, but I wanted to see, is there anything else that you guys would like to mention that we haven't talked about in terms of issues or process, or anything that you think our audience would be interested in watching the next 10 days?
I wanted to get Slater's prediction on when the session will end.
Now, it's supposed to end in 2 days, right?
Yeah, 9, but I'm not really counting. I think they conclude their policymaking business on time. To the extent that maybe they need to come back in a couple of weeks to finish up the budget once they better understand the strings attached to this federal funds, I think it's a deliberate process. And as long as they finish a budget by the middle or end of June, we're in a good place. I mean, we're talking about how we spend $100 billion here. I'd like them to take the time to get it right. Now, having said that, the 2 things that I love about Florida government is, number 1, our budget needs to be balanced, and number 2, there's a time clock. The budget needs to be in place by July 1. And so you've got these guardrails, but I think it's a lot of money. We're an incredible state. We deserve a legislature who cares about how every dollar is spent, and I think they'll get that done. They're sincere about that.
We haven't not gotten it done once, so I think we will get it done.
Yeah. So how will they extend it? I mean, they're supposed to be in 60-day session. Will they go into a special session, or what is the process for extending it?
Yeah, there's a couple different options from a process perspective, right, Carlecia? They can extend the session, And typically when they do that, they extend it only for budget purposes, which means every bill on the calendar dies. They can adjourn sine die, which also kills all the bills, including the budget, which they then have to kind of start over with. But you know, that's a process thing. But it's interesting. In order to call a special session, you need either the governor to call the legislature back, which is usually a recipe for disaster, or the Senate president and speaker to jointly call the legislature back. And I think the, you know, legislative special sessions are kind of like Fight Club. There's only one rule, and the one rule is to have the outcome agreed to before you start.
So which do you
Carlecia,
think,
how'd I do?
You did good. I agree. I think you're right. You just
so which do you
whatever he
think they're
said.
gonna do? You think they're gonna extend the session and only do the budget? Is that the
Well,
most
most of
likely?
the time, that's exactly what happens. Really, very rarely is ever a special session called for something other than the budget. Those are interesting
Very good.
outliers.
Slater, do you have a question of Carlecia?
Carlecia, how did she get to raise two awesome daughters? I mean,
She
what is her
would love
secret?
that you said that. She would love that you said that.
We're
I will tell her.
independent moms, so that's good. That's a good way to end. So
Yeah.
I want to thank the members of the audience. I want to especially thank our panel, Carlecia and Slater. We've covered a lot of material. You've given us your best informed guesses on this, but we're not, except for maybe the gambling one, we're not going to put money on too much here. But I think we can agree that it's going to be an interesting 10 days or so when we finish up the legislative session. So thank you all so much. Thanks to the audience. Thanks to the panelists. It was really a terrific session. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Weiss.
Thank you, Professor.